what Mary Trump has actually said in her own words, and how her family and the White House actually responded to it. Because the real story doesn't need embellishment, it's strange and unsettling enough on its own. Think about how rarely this actually happens in public life. Politicians get attacked by opponents constantly. They get criticized by journalists, mocked by comedians, investigated by prosecutors. All of that is baked into the job, and most public figures develop a kind of armor against it over time, a way of shrugging off attacks from people who were never going to be on their side anyway. What's much rarer, and much harder to shrug off, is sustained, detailed, on-the-record criticism from inside the family itself, from someone who isn't trying to win an election, doesn't work for a rival outlet, and has no obvious motive except, as she has said herself, a sense of obligation to tell people what she watched happen. That's the specific reason this story has had staying power for more than 5 years, through multiple election cycles, well past the usual shelf life of a political tell-all. So let's walk through it properly: who she is, what she actually documented, how her own family responded when the book landed, and what happened when other family members, including someone with far more institutional credibility than a memoirist, ended up saying strikingly similar things on tape without ever intending for the public to hear it. Mary L. Trump is not a pundit who studied the Trump family from a distance. She's Donald Trump's niece, the daughter of Fred Trump Jr., known to the family as Freddie, who was Donald's older brother. She grew up inside the same Queen's household that shaped Donald, watched the same family dynamics play out from the inside, and later trained as a clinical psychologist, earning a PhD from the Derner Institute of Advanced Psychological Studies at Adelphi University. Before turning to writing, she taught graduate coursework in trauma, psychopathology, and developmental psychology. That combination, a childhood spent inside the family and a professional career spent studying how early trauma shapes adult behavior, is exactly why her 2020 book landed as hard as it did. She wasn't a stranger speculating about a public figure from the outside. She was, as she put it plainly during a live television interview, someone with direct, lived experience of the household in question. The book is called Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. Simon & Schuster published it on July 14, 2020, in the middle of Donald Trump's re-election campaign. Before it even hit shelves, the Trump family tried to stop it. Robert Trump, Donald's younger brother, filed a lawsuit attempting to block its release. That effort failed, and the book went on to sell over 1 million copies on its release day alone. Strip away the headlines, and the book's core argument is fairly simple, and it's one that will sound familiar to anyone who has read about how families shape personality. Mary Trump argues that Donald's public behavior as an adult, the bragging, the inability to admit fault, the hostility toward criticism, isn't a personality he chose. It's a survival strategy he built as a child in response to a father who ran the household like a business that only rewarded one kind of output. She describes her grandfather, Fred Trump Sr., as a man who valued dominance above everything else and who divided his children into winners and losers early, then treated them accordingly for the rest of their lives. In her account, Fred Sr. mistreated his oldest son, Freddie, Mary's father, for the failure of choosing a career as an airline pilot instead of joining the family real estate business. Freddie eventually returned to the company, buckled under the pressure, struggled with alcoholism, and died at 42. Mary Trump has written that her father's decline unfolded in full view of a young Donald, who absorbed a very specific lesson from watching it happen. In this family, sympathy was a liability, and admitting weakness got you discarded. Her assessment of what that environment produced is blunt. In the book, she writes that a large number of people mistake Donald's arrogance for strength, mistake his false bravado for real accomplishment, and mistake his shallow interest in other people for charisma. That's not an aside. It's close to the thesis of the entire book. The public image, in her telling, was never actually earned. It was constructed, reinforced, and eventually mistaken by millions of people for the real thing. Mary Trump is careful, at least on paper, about the line between clinical diagnosis and informed observation. As a trained psychologist writing about a family member, she says outright that she has avoided offering a formal, outright diagnosis of Donald. But she doesn't pull punches when it comes to Fred Trump Sr. In the book, she describes her grandfather as what she calls a high-functioning sociopath, someone who used and manipulated the people around him, including his own children, for his own benefit. And when it comes to what that produced in Donald, she's equally direct elsewhere in the book, describing him as someone whose ego functions like a fragile, inadequate shield against reality, a shield that never had to hold up on its own because his father's money and connections were always standing behind it. Her argument is that this fragility is exactly why acknowledging any mistake, any failure, any criticism becomes so threatening. It's not ego in the ordinary sense. It's closer to a survival mechanism protecting something the person themselves suspects is hollow. She takes that argument further in a passage that's become one of the most quoted sections of the book. She writes that whenever Donald describes something as the greatest, the biggest, the best, always implying that he's the one responsible for making it that way, it's worth remembering that the person speaking is still, underneath it, the same child who was terrified of being seen as inadequate, the same way his older brother was. She argues that his boasting isn't really performed for the crowd in front of him. It's aimed, she suggests, at an audience of one, his father, who has been dead for over 2 decades. That's a striking claim, and it's important to be honest about its status. This is Mary Trump's psychological interpretation, informed by her clinical training and her personal history in the family, not an independently verified medical diagnosis. She herself draws that distinction. It's analysis, not a court finding. Beyond the broader psychological framework, the book contains a number of concrete, specific allegations, the kind that generated their own news cycles, separate from the book's overall argument. One of the most widely reported claims is that Donald Trump paid someone else to take the SAT for him in high school to help secure the score he needed. The White House flatly denied this at the time, calling it, in the words of a deputy press secretary, completely false. Another major claim relates to the family's finances. Mary Trump has said that the wealth attributed to Donald's business success was in large part propped up by his father, including, at one point, Fred Sr., arranging a monthly allowance in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to help Donald manage his debts during a period of financial distress. This dovetails with reporting Mary Trump was directly involved in. She has confirmed that she served as an anonymous source for a 2018 New York Times investigation into the Trump family's finances, providing tax documents that formed part of the paper's reporting on allegations of tax avoidance schemes spanning decades. That Times investigation was later awarded a Pulitzer Prize for its work. There's also a family legal dispute that predates the book by 2 decades, and that Mary Trump has referenced repeatedly as evidence of how the family treats people once they're no longer useful. After Fred Trump Sr. died in 1999, Mary and her brother contested his will, arguing it had been altered through undue influence by Donald, Marianne, and Robert at their father's and their own expense. According to Mary Trump, shortly after that legal challenge was filed, health insurance coverage was cut off for her brother's infant son, who had a serious medical condition. She told the New York Daily News at the time that her aunt and uncles should be ashamed of themselves, adding, "I'm sure they are not." The dispute was eventually settled, and the child's coverage was restored. Donald Trump later addressed the episode publicly, stating simply that he'd been angry because they had sued. These aren't abstract character observations. They're specific, checkable claims, and it's worth noting that some remain disputed. The White House response to the book at the time called it a collection of falsehoods and absurd allegations, and said it was motivated by financial self-interest rather than public concern. That's a fair rebuttal to include, because a responsible look at this story has to hold both things at once: a niece with first-hand knowledge and professional training, and a family flatly rejecting her account of events. It's also worth pointing out how differently these claims have aged. The tax reporting is probably the strongest example of a claim that moved from allegation in a memoir to independently documented fact, because Mary Trump wasn't just asserting it, she handed over the underlying paperwork to reporters who then spent over a year verifying it against public records before publishing. The Pulitzer Board doesn't award prizes for unverified family gossip. It awards them for investigative reporting that holds up to scrutiny, which is a meaningfully different bar than a single source's memory of a childhood conversation. The SAT claim sits in a different category. For years after the book's release, it was one of the more disputed specifics, since Mary Trump herself didn't name where the information originally came from. That changed only when audio surfaced independently, audio she hadn't planned to release. That traced the claim back to a second family member entirely. That's a meaningful distinction from a purely evidentiary standpoint. One detail went from an author's unsourced assertion to a claim independently corroborated by 2 family members who, by that point, weren't even coordinating with each other on messaging. The insurance dispute, by contrast, is the claim with the most documentary backing of all, because it played out partly in open court and in contemporaneous news coverage from 1999. Well before anyone had written a book about any of it. Court filings and newspaper reporting from that period corroborate the basic sequence of events: a will contested, a policy change affecting a sick infant, a public statement from Mary Trump condemning it, and an eventual settlement. When a claim has that kind of paper trail sitting outside of anyone's memoir, it's on considerably firmer ground than claims that rest on personal recollection alone. Donald Trump's own reaction to the book when it came out was notably restrained compared to how he often responds to critics. Speaking with Chris Wallace on Fox News Sunday, he called the book disgraceful and made a point of distancing himself from its author personally rather than engaging with its specific claims, saying she was not exactly a family favorite and that the family didn't have much respect or affection for her. That response, not a direct rebuttal of the substance, but a redirection toward the credibility and standing of the person delivering the criticism, is actually a pattern Mary Trump herself has pointed to in later interviews and writing as a recurring family, and in her view, political habit. She's argued across multiple interviews since 2020 that the more useful thing to watch isn't the anger a piece of criticism generates, but whether the substance of the criticism ever actually gets addressed or whether the conversation quietly shifts to attacking the credibility of whoever raised it. The White House's formal statement at the time took a similar approach, describing Donald's relationship with his father as warm and loving, denying the SAT claim outright, and framing Mary Trump's account as financially motivated rather than a good faith attempt at public disclosure. When Mary Trump appeared on ABC's The View shortly after publication, co-host Meghan McCain pushed her hard on a related point. How much authority does someone with a distant, largely severed relationship to the current generation of the family actually have to speak about them? Mary Trump's answer was that her relationship with her younger cousins wasn't really the point. The book, she said, was about explaining how Donald became who he is, a foundational story rooted in decades of family history, not a commentary on people she barely knows today. One thread runs through nearly everything Mary Trump has said publicly since the book came out. Across interviews, op-eds, and her ongoing Substack newsletter, the idea that these family patterns didn't disappear once Donald became a public figure. They simply moved onto a bigger stage, with real consequences. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she wrote some of her sharpest criticism, arguing that Donald's inability to publicly acknowledge suffering, whether it was the toll of the virus or the struggles of everyday Americans, traced directly back to lessons learned in that Queen's household, where any association with weakness was treated as dangerous. She wrote that for Donald, there was no functional value in empathy because there was no tangible benefit to it, a framework, she argued, that made it nearly impossible for him to publicly grieve alongside a country that was grieving. She's also repeatedly returned to the idea that Fred Sr. built a household defined by division, turning his children against one another for his own benefit, and that this same instinct for division became, in her telling, one of Donald's most consistent political tools. She's argued that it's not a strategy he calculated so much as the only operating mode he was ever taught. This through line matters because it's the part of her argument that extends beyond any single scandal or news cycle. Her claim isn't Donald Trump did this one specific bad thing. It's that a set of very early, very specific family lessons about fear, about loyalty, about what happens to people who admit fault, became a template he's applied consistently for decades, in business and later in politics, regardless of which specific controversy is in front of him at any given moment. It would be misleading to treat too much and never enough as a one-time event that ended once the news cycle moved on. Mary Trump has remained a visible, vocal presence in American political commentary for years afterward, and her public statements have continued to track closely with the same core argument. During the 2024 campaign, she was an active and sharp critic on social media, frequently responding in real time to her uncle's public appearances. After one Mar-a-Lago press conference in the summer of 2024, she posted a widely shared comment describing him as resembling, in her words, an aging relative ranting on a street corner surrounded by flags, adding pointedly, "I should know." She also hosted live commentary sessions on her own YouTube channel, reacting to his public appearances, at one point describing him during a press conference as visibly rattled and afraid. More recently, in a Substack post from May 2025, after Donald Trump's return to office following the 2024 election, she described the country as living through what she called uniquely dangerous times and a treacherous point in American history. She wrote that she remains committed to opposing her uncle's politics because she believes it's necessary and warned that continued erosion of democratic institutions was already underway. She's been consistent. In other words, this isn't a position she took once around a book launch and abandoned. It's a stance she has restated in increasingly direct terms for half a decade. It's worth being fair here, too. Mary Trump is not a neutral commentator. She's a declared political opponent of her uncle, and she says so herself. She's endorsed his political rivals publicly and been open about voting against him. None of that makes her documented claims automatically false, but it does mean her analysis comes from someone with a clear, stated political position, and that context belongs in any honest accounting of what she said. Here's the part of this story that often gets lost, and it matters because it means this isn't a case of one relative's word against the rest of the family's. A month after the book came out, the Washington Post published something that made Mary Trump's claims much harder to wave away, as one estranged niece's grudge, roughly 15 hours of audio, recorded between 2018 and 2019 of Donald Trump's own older sister, Marianne Trump, Barry, a retired federal appellate judge, describing her brother in strikingly similar terms. Mary Trump had recorded the conversations herself during the period surrounding the family's legal disputes over Fred Trump estate. A spokesperson for Mary Trump later explained that she began recording because she believed family members had misrepresented facts in earlier legal depositions, and she wanted a record to protect herself if the dispute escalated further. What's on those tapes doesn't sound like the language of someone still fond of her brother. In one recording, Marianne Trump Barry says flatly that he has no principles, repeating the word none twice for emphasis. In another, discussing his public conduct, she describes him using a single, unambiguous word, cruel, she goes on, in her own words, to describe the entire persona as phoniness layered over cruelty, not a complicated psychological theory, just a blunt assessment from someone who had watched him for decades. She also complained separately about his conduct on Twitter, saying she had personally told him to stop and get rid of the platform altogether, advice he obviously never took. Perhaps most notably, Barry is also the source confirmed later by reporting, not something Mary Trump had disclosed in the book itself, of the SAT claim. On tape, she says he got into the University of Pennsylvania because he had somebody take the exams. That's a serious allegation coming from a retired federal judge about her own brother, not an unnamed source or a secondhand rumor. The book itself, separately from the tapes, includes other blunt lines Mary Trump attributes to her aunt, including Marianne calling her brother a clown, and when Mary asked whether anyone genuinely believed he was a self-made success story, Marianne's reported reply pointed to his 5 corporate bankruptcies as the obvious answer. When these recordings became public, the White House response echoed the same pattern we've already seen. Rather than engaging with the specific content, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows focused on the circumstances of the recording itself, calling it another day, another political attack, and noting that Mary Trump had been openly supportive of the opposing presidential campaign. Donald Trump's own statement, issued through the White House just after the death of his younger brother Robert, was brief and dismissive. Every day it's something else. Who cares? He pivoted immediately to a note about missing his late brother and a general claim about the country's direction, without directly disputing anything his sister had said. Marianne Trump Barry herself never publicly confirmed or denied the recordings. She died in November 2023, having never addressed the tapes on the record. Why include this at all in a story ostensibly about Mary Trump? Because it changes the shape of the argument. This is no longer just a niece with a professional angle and a political preference making claims about an uncle she's estranged from. It's that same set of claims, independently echoed almost word for word by the subject's own sister, a sitting-turned-retired federal judge with no book deal, no publisher, and, at the time the tapes were recorded, no apparent plan to ever have the conversations made public at all. Mary Trump isn't the only member of her generation of the family to go public with a critical account. Her brother, Fred Trump III, later published his own memoir, describing a similar picture of a family that prized toughness and public image over care for its own members, most pointedly around the medical needs of his son, William, whose serious health condition became entangled in the very inheritance dispute Mary Trump has referenced for years. Fred III has said publicly that watching his family's response to his son's needs during that period shaped his understanding of where he stood in the family hierarchy and why. The two siblings have told overlapping versions of the same story from different angles, one through a clinical, historical lens aimed at explaining Donald's psychology, the other through the more personal experience of being on the receiving end of the family's priorities during a medical crisis. Neither account exists in isolation, and neither depends solely on the other to hold up. But together they form a more complete picture of a family whose internal conflicts spilled into public view more than once, and not just through one member's book tour. So why does a 5-year-old book and years of ongoing commentary from an estranged family member still generate this much attention? Probably because the argument at the center of it taps into something people intuitively suspect about public figures in general. Not just this one, that the polished, confident, unshakable image so many leaders project is often built to cover something much more fragile underneath, and that the people closest to that image, family members, former employees, former partners, are often the only ones who ever actually see the gap between the performance and the person. Mary Trump's argument, at its most basic, is that strength and the appearance of strength are not the same thing, and that a public life built entirely around avoiding any appearance of weakness eventually produces someone who cannot tolerate correction of any kind, because correction, to that person, doesn't feel like information. It feels like an existential threat. Whether or not you find her specific claims persuasive, whether you view her as a credible insider or a disgruntled relative capitalizing on a famous name, the broader question she keeps returning to is one that applies well beyond any single family or any single politician. How do you tell the difference between someone who is actually confident and someone who has simply never been allowed to be anything else? There's also something worth sitting with about how families produce these patterns in the first place, and it's the part of Mary Trump's professional background, the clinical training, not the memoir writing, that gives this argument more weight than an ordinary family dispute aired in public. Developmental psychologists have written for decades about what happens to children raised in households where love and approval are tied strictly to performance, and where any expression of vulnerability is treated as a liability rather than something to be supported. The pattern she describes isn't unique to wealthy families or famous ones. It shows up in workplaces, in sports, in ordinary households, wherever the underlying message a child receives is that being loved is conditional on winning, and that admitting a mistake is functionally the same as inviting abandonment. What makes the Trump family version of this story unusual isn't the dynamic itself, it's the scale of what one child raised inside it eventually went on to do with the habits it produced. A fair-minded reading of all of this has to resist the urge to pick a single, tidy conclusion. On one hand, you have a licensed clinical psychologist trained specifically in trauma and developmental psychology, offering a detailed account of a household she grew up inside, an account partially corroborated by tax records serious enough to win a Pulitzer, by court documents from a decades-old inheritance dispute, and, later, by secretly recorded audio of the subject's own sister independently describing him in remarkably similar language. That's a substantial body of overlapping, independently sourced material, and it doesn't all trace back to one person's motivated memory. On the other hand, you have a family that has consistently and publicly rejected large parts of that account, a White House that called specific claims false on the record, and an author who has been open about her own political opposition to the person she's writing about. Facts that don't disprove her claims, but that any careful reader should weigh honestly rather than waving away. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. A source can have a clear point of view and also be providing accurate, independently verifiable information. A family can deny painful claims and also have members who, separately and without coordinating, described almost identical patterns using almost identical language. None of this resolves into a single simple headline, and maybe that's the most honest place to leave it. None of this is presented here as a final verdict. Mary Trump's book and her years of subsequent commentary represent one specific, deeply personal, professionally informed, and politically motivated perspective on a public figure, not an independently adjudicated set of facts. The Trump family and the White House have disputed specific claims within it, sometimes directly and on the record, and that pushback deserves to be weighed alongside her account rather than ignored. What can be said with confidence is this: a trained clinical psychologist who spent her childhood inside the Trump family wrote a detailed, specific account arguing that decades-old patterns of fear, favoritism, and punishment for weakness shaped the man who later became president. And that account, whatever you make of it, was significant enough that his own family tried to legally block its publication before a single copy reached readers. That's not a manufactured drama built for an internet audience. That's a real, documented, still unfolding chapter in how one of the most scrutinized families in modern American life has argued in public about its own history and about what that history means for the country that elected one of its members twice. The rest is, as it should be, left to you to weigh for yourself.